Imagine moving into your dream home. Fresh paint still on the walls, sunlight spilling across the yard, and within days, a stranger in a bright pink suit storms onto your driveway, jabbing her finger like she owns the ground beneath your feet. Behind her, two uniformed officers linger silently, not saying a word, just watching. She waves a stack of fake-looking papers in your face and declares, "This house, it's under my authority." Your heart sinks, not because she's right, but because she's wrong. Completely wrong. You're not even part of her HOA. Your property deed proves it. 50 yards outside their boundary, free and clear. But logic doesn't matter here. She smiles that unsettling smile of someone who's convinced the rules of the world bend around her will. And just like that, what should have been a peaceful life in the suburbs turns into a battlefield. Fines start appearing in your mailbox. Inspections you never requested. Phone calls from city offices that never existed. Every day, a new layer of chaos. And through it all, she doesn't back down. This isn't just about property lines or neighborhood politics. This is about control, about obsession, about a war waged not with fists, but with paperwork, threats, and public humiliation. By the time you realize how far she's willing to go, it's already too late. Because this pink-suited neighbor doesn't just want compliance. She wants domination. And in her world, no boundary, no law, not even common sense will stop her. The story begins the way most suburban dreams do. Quiet streets lined with freshly planted trees, kids pedaling their bikes in lazy circles, the faint smell of barbecue drifting through the air. To anyone driving by, this neighborhood looked like the perfect picture of order and community. Every lawn was trimmed, every mailbox matched, and every driveway gleamed with polished cars. It was the kind of place people imagined when they said they wanted peace and stability. For John and his wife, moving here felt like the final step in building the life they'd always wanted. They had saved for years, scrimping and sacrificing, all for this house, a modest two-story home with white shutters and a backyard big. Enough for their daughter to finally have the swing set she had been begging for. John would sip his coffee each morning on the porch, watching the sun rise over his freshly painted fence, feeling as though, for once, life had slowed down just enough for him to enjoy it. At first, everything seemed perfect. Neighbors waved politely on evening walks. Packages arrived without incident. Even the sound of sprinklers clicking on at dawn gave John a sense of rhythm and safety. The family decorated their new home carefully, putting flower beds along the walkway and a bench under the old oak tree. To them, this wasn't just property, it was the heart of their new beginning. But if you looked just closely enough, there were cracks beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect community. The kind that only reveal themselves once you've settled in. Every HOA-run neighborhood has its figurehead, the person who believes the bylaws are sacred scripture and whose entire identity is wrapped around power. Here, that figure took the form of a woman in a blinding pink suit. At first, she was just a distant presence. A sharp voice barking orders at the landscapers, a flash of color as she hurried across the street, clipboard in hand. Sometimes, John noticed her parked outside different houses, peering over fences or scribbling into her notebook. The neighbors whispered about her, but always in hushed tones, never daring to speak too loudly, as if summoning her wrath might bring trouble to their own doors. It didn't take long before John realized that this wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a kingdom. and the pink-suited woman, the HOA president, ruled it with an iron fist disguised in manicured nails. Still, John brushed it off. He wasn't officially part of her HOA. His house, just 50 yards outside their jurisdiction, technically stood free of her reach. The paperwork was clear. He told himself it wasn't his concern. He had no reason to get involved in the politics of lawn heights or mailbox paint colors. But then came the first letter. Folded neatly, stuffed into his mailbox without a stamp, written in bold, officious language. It demanded he repaint his shutters that weren't even under her authority. At first, he laughed it off. Probably a mistake, he thought. But when a second letter arrived the following week, followed by a friendly reminder taped to his front door, the unease set in. The pink-suited woman wasn't making a mistake. She knew exactly what she was doing. And though John didn't know it yet, that was only the beginning. The beginning of this story looks like a suburban postcard. Rows of houses nearly identical, their lawns clipped with surgical precision, sidewalks swept clean as if dust itself wasn't allowed to linger here. From a distance, it was perfection. Families strolling with strollers, children drawing chalk figures on the driveway, neighbors offering polite nods as they watered their roses. To anyone just passing by, this community seemed flawless. But like most places that shine too brightly, on the outside the shadows underneath were much darker. For John and his wife Emily, moving here had been a dream come true. Years of scraping together savings, cutting back on vacations, and saying no to luxuries had finally led them to this house, 2 stories tall, white shutters, a porch just wide enough for a rocking chair, and morning coffee. Emily cried the day they moved in, not out of exhaustion, but out of joy. Their daughter, Lily, ran straight to the backyard and declared it her kingdom. Racing around the oak tree that stretched its branches proudly across their property line. John felt proud. Really proud. For years, life had been about chasing, about working harder just to stay afloat. But here, finally, he felt like he'd arrived. Each morning, he'd step outside with his mug of coffee, breathing in the still air, watching the sunlight spill across his fence. He'd nod at the sound of distant sprinklers and wave to the postman as if he'd been doing it for decades. For once, life wasn't rushing past him. For once, he could simply be. The neighborhood itself seemed welcoming at first glance. A retired couple next door offered them cookies. The man across the street waved as he washed his car. A group of kids came over to ask Lily if she wanted to play tag. There was a rhythm here, one that John thought would suit them perfectly. But it didn't take long to notice the patterns that kept this paradise running. Every lawn was cut to the same height. Every mailbox was painted the same shade of muted green. Every trash can appeared on the curb at exactly the same time and vanished just as quickly. Order ruled here, and behind that order was someone pulling the strings. At first, John only heard whispers, a neighbor lowering their voice when describing her, a quick glance over a shoulder before muttering, "Careful what you say," and then the first sighting. She appeared on a Tuesday morning, impossible to miss. A woman in a shockingly bright pink suit, heels clicking on the pavement as if the street itself were her runway. She carried a clipboard clutched tightly to her chest, her eyes scanning every detail of the houses she passed. Noticing chipped paint here, a crooked garden light there, scribbling furiously into her notes. Her presence was sharp, like the sudden crack of thunder on a clear day. Neighbors stiffened when she walked by. Conversations cut short. Smiles turned rigid. Even children seemed to sense something off, their laughter fading as she neared. She wasn't simply a resident, she was the enforcer, the ruler cloaked in pastel fabric. Everyone knew her name, though most didn't dare say it loudly. She was the HOA president, the one who treated neighborhood bylaws not as guidelines, but as holy scripture. And she had a reputation. Fines for mailboxes painted the wrong shade, threats of legal action for lawns an inch too tall, letters of warning for something as small as leaving a bicycle on the porch. John noticed her more and more after that day. Sometimes standing at the edge of a driveway, pointing and barking orders at landscapers. Other times parked in her car, peering over fences with binoculars. Once, he even spotted her standing across the street, staring at his house for several minutes before jotting something down and striding away. At first, he brushed it off. His home wasn't even within her HOA boundaries. 50 yards separated his deed from her kingdom. He wasn't subject to her rules, her fines, her obsession with conformity. That fact gave him comfort. Her world of petty control couldn't touch him, or so he thought. The first sign came quietly. A letter slipped into his mailbox. No stamp, no official seal. Just a typed sheet on standard paper with a bold headline. Notice of violation. It accused him of failing to maintain the approved color scheme for his shutters. John laughed when he read it, tossing it onto the counter. A simple mistake, he thought. She must not have realized his home wasn't part of her HOA. But the second letter arrived a week later. This one wasn't so polite. It threatened escalating. Fines for non-compliance and hinted at further action. The tone was colder, sharper, as though it came not from a neighbor, but from some faceless, bureaucratic machine. Emily frowned when she read it. But we're not in her HOA, right? John reassured her they weren't. The deed was clear, the property line indisputable. Yet the letters kept coming. Then came the note taped to their front door. Bold, underlined words. Final warning. And just beneath it, a scribbled signature in pink ink. The message was clear. She knew exactly what she was doing. The peaceful mornings on the porch began to feel different. John found himself looking over his shoulder as he sipped his coffee, scanning the street for that flash of pink. The air no longer felt calm. It felt watched, judged, controlled. The neighbors said nothing, but their silence said everything. When John tried to ask the man across the street if he'd ever dealt with similar letters, the man simply shook his head, eyes darting nervously, and went back to hosing down his driveway. Emily began to notice, too, cars slowing down outside their house. People whispering when they walked by. The faint feeling of being marked, singled out. Lily, once so free in her backyard kingdom, now played closer to the porch, glancing nervously whenever a car crept by too slowly. It was subtle at first, but it grew heavier with each passing day. What was supposed to be their sanctuary was becoming a cage. The bright pink suit had cast a shadow across their lives. John didn't know it yet, but the real battle hadn't even started. The letters were just the opening move. The HOA president wasn't content with her own domain. She wanted control over everything and everyone, even those who technically stood beyond her reach, and soon she would prove just how far she was willing to go. It started with letters, anonymous at first, then signed in pink ink, bold and confident, as if she were branding his life with her authority. But soon, the harassment evolved into something much larger, something that felt less like rules and more like war. John thought ignoring her would be enough. After all, he wasn't under her HOA. His deed, his property lines, everything proved it. But in communities like this, logic didn't matter. What mattered was power, and she had plenty of it. One Saturday morning, just as John was carrying a box of tools into the garage, a sharp knock echoed from the front door. He opened it to find not just her, standing tall in that shocking pink suit, but two uniformed police officers flanking her sides. Her smile was cold, rehearsed. "Good morning," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We've received reports of non-compliance on this property." John stared, dumbfounded. "Non-compliance? I'm not in your HOA." She tilted her head, feigning pity. "Property lines are tricky things. Sometimes maps don't reflect reality." The officer, to her left, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we just need to confirm some details." John's chest tightened. This wasn't just neighborly pettiness anymore. This was intimidation, with badges at her side. He swallowed hard, forcing calm into his voice. "You don't have jurisdiction. Here, not you, and not your HOA." For the briefest moment, her smile faltered. Then she leaned in closer. "We'll see about that." The officers left after a tense conversation, clearly aware they were being used but unwilling to intervene further. The woman in pink lingered just long enough to scribble something on her clipboard before striding away, her heels cracking against the driveway like hammer blows. Emily's hands shook as she clutched the curtain. Lily peeked from behind her legs, wide-eyed and confused, and John felt it deep in his gut. This wasn't going to stop. Over the next weeks, the pressure built. A citation appeared taped to their door, accusing them of unauthorized modifications to their fence. Then another, for unapproved lawn ornamentation, pointing to Lily's plastic swing set. Neighbors stopped waving. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others whispered in clusters at the edge of their driveways, glancing toward John's house with uneasy expressions. It became clear that she was turning the entire community against him. Late one night, John heard voices outside. He peeked through the blinds and froze. Two men in reflective vests were measuring his fence line, guided by the HOA president's sharp gestures. She wasn't just writing letters anymore. She was gathering ammunition. John stormed outside, demanding answers, but the men ignored him, jotting notes on clipboards. When he confronted her directly, she raised a single eyebrow, her voice dripping. "With mockery! Everything must be documented, Mr. Carter. It's protocol!" He wanted to scream, to rip the clipboard from her hands. But the smug smirk on her face told him that's exactly what she wanted. To push him into snapping, to make him the villain of his own story. So he clenched his fists and walked back inside. But his silence felt like surrender. Soon, small inconveniences piled up like deliberate sabotage. Trash collectors skipped their bin while every other house on the street was emptied. A landscaper John had hired suddenly canceled, citing community complaints. Packages from Amazon vanished from the porch. Emily grew anxious. her once bright laughter replaced with a constant edge of fear. Lily started asking why kids at school said their family was in trouble with the neighborhood. And John, he was caught between fury and despair. Every part of him screamed to fight back, but each move seemed to tighten the net she was weaving around him. The worst came one Thursday afternoon. He returned from work to find a giant neon orange sticker plastered on his front window. Notice, property in violation. It wasn't just a letter anymore. It was public shaming, a scarlet letter for the whole street to see. John tore it down with shaking hands, his face hot with rage. He wanted to march straight to her house and demand she stop. But across the street, she was already standing there. Pink. Suit gleaming in the afternoon sun, arms crossed, watching him like a predator watching prey. The next day, John went to the county records office. He dug through deeds, maps, legal boundaries, anything to prove once and for all that his property stood outside her reach. And he found it. A clear, indisputable survey showing his lot was separate, untouched by the HOA, armed with paperwork. He returned home, ready to finally put an end to her games. He marched to her door, pounded until she answered, and thrust the documents into her hands. "Here," he spat, "black and white. You have no authority over me. None. Stop harassing my family." For a moment, she simply stared at the papers. Then, slowly, her lips curved into a smile. She folded the pages neatly, tucked them into her clipboard, and looked up. "You think a few papers will save you?" she said softly, almost kindly. "John, this isn't about paperwork. This is about order, and people around here want order." Her words chilled him. It wasn't about rules at all. It was about control. The following week, a community meeting was announced. Flyers appeared on every door except John's. Curious, he showed up anyway. The clubhouse was packed, voices buzzing in anticipation. At the front, under bright fluorescent lights, stood the woman in pink. She addressed the crowd with passion, painting a picture of decline and threats to property values. Though she never mentioned John by name, every example she gave pointed to him: a fence out of alignment, a yard ornament out of character, a family who refused to cooperate. Whispers filled the room. Eyes turned. By the time she finished her speech, John felt like an outcast in the very neighborhood he'd once loved. When he tried to speak, she cut him off. "You're not an HOA member. You don't have speaking privileges here." The crowd applauded. It was in that moment John realized he wasn't just up against her. He was up against an entire community she had bent to her will. That night, John sat alone on his porch long after Emily and Lily had gone to bed. The papers he'd shown her, the humiliation at the meeting, the endless harassment, it all boiled inside him. She had turned his dream home into a nightmare. She had poisoned his neighbors against him, stolen his peace, and made his daughter afraid to play in her own yard. And for what? For a sense of power. For control. For ego. John stared at the darkened houses, the silent street, and felt something shift inside him. He had tried playing fair. He had tried logic, patience, even kindness. But those things meant nothing to someone like her. If she wanted a war, then maybe it was time he gave her one. It wasn't the letters. It wasn't the neon violation stickers. It wasn't even the police visits, the sabotage, or the meetings where she turned the entire neighborhood against him. It was the notice nailed into the wood of his front porch. Bold black letters glaring in the morning sun. Emily found it first. Her scream pulled John out of the shower, heart pounding, towel barely clinging to his waist. He stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the notice as if it were a hallucination. "That's not possible," he whispered. "She can't. She has no jurisdiction." But Emily's eyes brimmed with tears. "John, she's trying to take our home." The pink-suited tyrant had crossed the final line, and John realized this wasn't just harassment anymore. This was annihilation. A week later, the HOA summoned a special hearing. Flyers plastered every mailbox, except his, of course. But he showed up anyway, storming into the clubhouse with Emily at his side and Lily clutching her stuffed rabbit. The room fell silent as he entered. Rows of neighbors sat stiffly, eyes filled with judgment, pity, or something colder. At the front, under the unforgiving fluorescent light, the HOA president stood in her signature shocking pink suit, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Carter," she said sweetly, her voice carrying venom beneath the sugar, "you've been accused of repeated violations, refusals to comply, and creating a hostile environment for our community. The board has voted to pursue foreclosure to recover unpaid fines and damages." John's pulse hammered in his ears. Slammed a folder of county records onto the podium. "You have no authority over me. My property is not part of your HOA. This is harassment, extortion, fraud." Gasps rippled through the crowd. For the first time, doubt flickered across some of the neighbors' faces. But the president only smiled. "Jurisdiction is flexible when property values are at stake. This community deserves order, and you, Mr. Carter, refuse to cooperate." She turned to the board members seated beside her, puppets nodding on command. "All in favor of proceeding with foreclosure?" Hands rose. One by one, like a jury condemning a man to death. Emily sobbed quietly. Lily buried her face in her stuffed rabbit. John felt his world closing in, the walls pressing tighter and tighter. He was outnumbered, outvoted, outcast, but not out of moves. The next morning, John didn't go to work. He went to war at the county courthouse. He filed complaints. He presented every deed, every survey, every map proving his independence from the HOA. He demanded an injunction against their fraudulent foreclosure, and then he made one more stop at the office of a local investigative reporter. By that evening, the story was online. HOA targets family in fraudulent foreclosure scheme. The article spread like wildfire. Comment sections filled with outrage, calls for accountability, and threats of lawsuits against the HOA. For the first time in months, John felt a spark of hope. But the woman in pink wasn't done. It happened. 3 nights later, John woke to the sound of engines, the glare of headlights flooding his bedroom. He rushed to the window, and his blood ran cold. Tow trucks, 3 of them, backing into his driveway. He sprinted outside barefoot, shouting, demanding answers. But the drivers only shrugged. "Order from the HOA. They said these vehicles were abandoned. They're mine," John roared. "You can't touch them." And then he saw her, standing across the street in her shocking pink suit, arms folded, smiling, watching. "Stop this!" John bellowed. but his words were drowned out by the mechanical groan of the tow trucks hauling away his family's cars. Emily clutched Lily on the porch, both crying. The sound of the chains, the revving engines, the screech of tires. It felt like the soundtrack of their destruction. When the last truck disappeared down the street, silence fell. John stood trembling in the driveway, his fists clenched so tight, his nails drew blood. Across the street, the HOA president gave him a small, mocking wave. Then she turned, her heels clicking against the pavement, and vanished into the night. Something inside John snapped that night. She had taken his peace, his reputation, his money, his dignity. Now she was taking his very ability to live. But what she didn't know, what nobody in the community knew, was that John had been planning, quietly, carefully, collecting every letter, recording every confrontation, filing every document, and now he was ready to use it. The next HOA meeting was supposed to be routine, a dull recitation of budgets, landscaping projects, and violation updates. But when John entered carrying a thick black binder under his arm, the room shifted. Gasps, murmurs, stares. He walked straight to the podium and dropped the binder with a thunderous slam. "This," he said, his voice low but steady, "is every illegal action this HOA has taken against me. Every fraudulent citation, every trespass, every stolen package, every police call you orchestrated, and this," he held up a stack of papers, "is a court order, effective immediately. This HOA is under investigation for fraud, harassment, and abuse of power." The room erupted. Neighbors shouted, chairs scraped, phones flashed as people recorded. The board members shifted nervously, whispering to each other, and then John turned his eyes on her, the woman in pink. She sat perfectly still, her smile brittle, her knuckles white as she gripped her clipboard. "You thought you could break me," John said, his voice rising. "But you underestimated one thing. I don't break. And now, it's your turn to answer." The next days unfolded like wildfire. The story spread across local news, then national. Reporters camped outside the neighborhood. Cameras flashed. Microphones shoved forward. Neighbors who once turned their backs now scrambled to distance themselves. "We had no idea," they said. "We thought she was just enforcing rules." But it was too late. The county investigation confirmed what John had known all along. His property was never part of the HOA. Every fine, every citation, every action against him had been fraudulent. And the foreclosure attempt? Criminal. Lawsuits followed. Bored. Members resigned in disgrace. The HOA's bank accounts were frozen, and the president, the woman in pink, she was arrested, charged with fraud, harassment, falsification of records, and abuse of authority. John was there when they took her away, standing on his porch with Emily and Lily at his side. She met his gaze one last time as the officers cuffed her hands. Her pink suit now wrinkled and stained. For the first time, her smile was gone. As the police car disappeared down the street, John felt a rush of relief unlike anything he'd ever known. His family was safe. His home was his again. Justice had been served, but as he turned back toward his house, his phone buzzed. A text. "Unknown number." She wasn't working alone, and it's not over. John froze, staring at the glowing screen, his heart thundering. Emily's voice broke the silence. "John, what is it?" He slipped the phone into his pocket. forcing a smile he didn't feel. "Nothing," he lied. "Let's go inside." But deep down, he knew the fight was far from finished. The house felt quiet. Not the tense, suffocating silence of fear that had haunted it for months, but something lighter, freer. John stood at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the street. For the first time in forever, he could breathe. Emily hummed softly as she poured Lily's cereal, her movements unhurried. Lily laughed at the way the milk splashed, unafraid of being hushed. This was what peace looked like. This was what victory sounded like. And yet, John's phone still lay heavy in his pocket, the message echoing in his mind. She wasn't working alone. And it's not over. The arrest had detonated like a bomb in the community. Neighbors who once clung to the HOA's rules like scripture now whispered in driveways, ashamed. Lawns that once looked identical suddenly sprouted individuality, flower beds, in unexpected colors, porches with swings, fences painted without approval. The spell had been broken, but not everyone celebrated. A small group lingered in denial, muttering about how John had destroyed order and brought shame to the neighborhood. They glared when he passed, clutching their clipboards and printouts of bylaws, as if paper could rebuild their crumbling power. Still, more and more people came to him quietly. "We're sorry," they said. "We should have spoken up sooner." John nodded, but his smile never quite reached his eyes. Trust once broken didn't rebuild overnight. That night, as they sat on the porch, Emily finally let the walls down. "You know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought we were going to lose everything. The house, our family, you." Her tears glistened in the moonlight. John took her hand, feeling the rough calluses of months spent fighting battles no one should ever have to fight. "You saved us," she said. "You stood up when I didn't think I could anymore." But John shook his head. "I didn't save us. We saved each other. If you hadn't stood by me, if Lily hadn't given me a reason to keep going, I would have given up." Emily smiled through her tears, resting her head against his shoulder. And for the first time in months, John allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst was over. Weeks later, the trial began. Cameras lined the courthouse steps, reporters jostling for sound bites. Inside, the evidence was overwhelming. Fraudulent documents, falsified records, harassment complaints. It was all laid bare. The judge's words rang out like a hammer striking steel. This HOA operated outside its jurisdiction. Mr. Carter's property was never subject to its authority. The actions taken against him were unlawful, malicious, and constitute fraud. Cheers erupted in the courtroom. Emily wept openly. John closed his eyes, a weight lifting from his chest he hadn't realized was still there. The verdict wasn't just a win. It was vindication. Damages were awarded, restitution ordered. The HOA, what remained of it, was dismantled. And the woman in pink? She faced years behind bars, but victory came with scars. John's savings were depleted. His reputation, though restored in law, still bore the shadows of whispered lies. His friendships in the neighborhood were fractured, some beyond repair, and inside something had changed. He no longer looked at quiet streets and manicured lawns with comfort. He looked at them and wondered, what's hiding behind those windows? What power games are waiting in the shadows? The innocence of suburban living was gone. One evening, months later, a plain white envelope arrived. No return address. Just his name scrawled across the front. John's hands shook as he opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper. She wasn't working alone. Watch the Board of County Supervisors. No signature, no explanation. John folded it slowly, staring into the distance. Emily saw the look on his face. "What is it?" she asked softly. He forced a smile. Nothing important. But deep down, he knew the war might have ended. But the game wasn't over. The community's transformation by the year's end, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. The HOA's collapse left a vacuum, but instead of chaos, something new blossomed. Neighbors began organizing barbecues, block parties, volunteer cleanups. Decisions were made together, not dictated from a podium. People laughed more. Children played freely. The fear of pink notices taped to doors was gone. John stood back. Watching it unfold, it was bittersweet. He had fought for this freedom, but he no longer felt like he belonged in the same way. He was the scar tissue of the neighborhood, a reminder of both the wound and the healing. One night he sat in his office, staring at the thick black binder. That had once been his weapon. He thought of Emily's tears, of Lily clutching her stuffed rabbit, of the tow trucks, the foreclosure notice, the courtroom cheers, and he whispered to himself, "Never again." Never again would he let silence win. Never again would he believe that bullies in suits and clipboards held more power than truth. He closed the binder gently and set it on the shelf, not as a weight anymore, but as a warning. And then, looking out at the street where neighbors now laughed under string lights, he finally understood. The battle hadn't just been for his home. It had been for something bigger, for every family too afraid to speak, for every homeowner bullied into silence, for every community where fear disguised itself as order. The lesson was simple but powerful. You don't defeat darkness by hiding from it. You defeat it by shining a light. The camera would linger on John, standing in his yard at dusk, Lily's laughter echoing behind him, Emily calling his name from the porch. The sky glows orange and purple, peaceful at last, and just as he turns to go inside, the faint sound of footsteps echoes from across the street. The frame tilts, catching a figure watching from the shadows, clipboard in hand. Then, cut to black.